Welcome to Syntax. On this Monday Hasty Treat, we're going to be talking all about cloud storage. You got to put your stuff in the cloud, you got to be able to access it, and because of that, we're going to be talking about storage itself as well as bandwidth, all of the different terminologies and services you need to know in this topic.
And big zips.
Big zips. Big zips and big pipes. Got to have them both here. So let's get into it. My name is Scott Tolinsky. I'm a developer from Denver. With me, as always, is Wes Boss.
Hey. Yeah, I've been dipping into this a little bit lately. I've hosted stuff on cloud providers for probably over 10 years now. But recently, I was looking at moving some of my stuff to a cloud provider. And I was like, oh, let me revisit this. I've been using Backblaze B2 for quite a while. But let's see if there's anything else different. And I've been noticing the Cloudflare one a lot lately as well, Cloudflare R2. So I dipped into it and I learned a lot. So I'm here to explain it all to you.
Yeah, sick. I'm excited about that. I've stored on all kinds of things. So I'm interested to hear what some of these other options are that I have not tried to store on yet. This episode, as well as every episode, is presented by Sentry. Sentry is the perfect place to track all of your errors and exceptions. This could be handy if, let's say, I've had situations when I ran level up tutorials where people would say they can't access the download. Maybe it's throwing an error when they try to access the download. And if you're selling a product that relies on that download, it's really important that your users aren't the first ones to bring that to your attention. So with something like Sentry, you can set up alerts for any error that happens in your application, and you can make sure that if there is a issue with a critical part of your infrastructure, whether that is grabbing a big zip from an S3 bucket and downloading it or what, that you get access to all those errors and are able to solve it. So head on over to sentry.io/syntax, sign up and get 2 months for free.
All right, let's talk all about it. Storing data can be confusing and expensive. You have to consider a couple things. You have to consider the cost of storing that data. You have to consider the bandwidth of people downloading it. And you also have to consider how quickly do you need it. So let's say you have large files. So all of the ones we're going to be talking about today are what are called object storage or blob storage. And essentially what that means is it's a spot to put files. It can be any type of file. It can be any hunk of a file. It could be part of a file, but you can essentially think of them as a place to store large files. So things like big zips, software downloads, log files, images, videos, user data, backups, all of those types of things are often not part of your application, but you put them on a cloud storage provider because it would be too expensive. I'll talk about that in just a second. So let's first talk about a couple different ways that we use cloud storage. I just went through all of mine and I took a look at what am I actually storing? So my biggest one is I use backups, meaning that I have a Synology NAS locally in my house. And I have that entire thing, not the entire thing actually. I have the important parts, which is my recording files, courses that I don't want on my laptop, stuff like that. I have that mirror to Backblaze B2, and that's about 2.5 terabytes of data. And anytime I throw something onto my NAS, it just auto syncs and uploads it to Backblaze B2 so that I have a backup because one backup of a file is not a backup. That's where your file lives.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it does feel like the era of, oh man, your LaCie drive has all of a sudden stopped working and your backup is toast is over. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be.
It's not. I literally last night on TikTok, I saw this photographer and maybe in the developer community, this is a thing of the past, but my sister's a photographer. I talked to so many of them. They have dozens of these little LaCie drives all around their house.
They're probably moving them around a lot.
At least once a year and a half, I get a panic message from a friend of a friend. My hard drive's clicking and I can't turn it on and it has wedding photos from this couple. Please. Especially just a little thing that is so easily dropped. This is not the backup show. Well, maybe we'll do that again, that show as well. But man, what else did we put there? I put the original recordings on. So when I'm recording a course or this podcast, the raw files can be very, very large. And sometimes you want to keep those raw files. So it's nice to have a spot to put those. I put caption files on there so I can download them and put them into my course player. These big zips for all of my courses is another one that I do. So like 99% of people stream the course, right? You get a nice experience, you get the notes along with it, you track your progress, but some people just want the MP4 files so they can download it and watch it locally. So in order to allow that, I throw them up on one of these cloud providers and allow them to download it. Older code bases, I have basically 15 years of web development of old websites that I've built. And I don't delete them. I just put them up. You could put them on GitHub as well, but I just drag and drop, put the whole sucker up on a cloud provider. And then I've been recently, this is why I got into this, is I've been trying to find a solution for going off of Cloud App, which is my screenshot, kind of quick file hosting. You need to send somebody a file, you need to send them a video. And somebody on Twitter recommended Dropshare, which is really cool. It's essentially a screenshot tool, also file hosting, but you pay for the app once and then you connect it to any of these cloud providers. And that seems ideal to me. So I'm looking at figuring out how to move all my 15 years of screenshots and file uploads over to that.
It does seem like a good approach to that, right? Because then it's not tying you into, their full infrastructure. You can still own the bucket with all of the data, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I use cloud storage for a few things. Images, maybe not something you mentioned. Images,
Yep.
Hey, especially in websites where users are uploading images, things can fill up really quickly. Back in the day in WordPress and Drupal land, you just uploaded it to your own local server. That was fine, but if you host these in the cloud, they can be accessed by all kinds of things and not just the current application that you're using. Either way, user images, you can create transformed images, video. Oftentimes, you'll need to transcode video into a whole bunch of different formats, especially if you're streaming video.
Yep.
Like you said, big zips. I throw my zips up on a Backblaze B2 that we'll talk a little bit more about, but I hosted all my big zips there as well. And just really that's pretty much it for me. And you know what? I don't have an offsite backup, Wes. I have a double backup system, but it's all local. So yeah.
You got to fix that
do something
tonight.
about
You're not
that.
going to be able to sleep. What happens? The last podcast, you just talked about a tree falling on your office. What happens if a tree goes right through your hard drive? What if someone breaks in and steals it?
I'll
You're
build a
pooched.
box for it. I'm pooched. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. You're right. And I did lose a 200 gigabyte LaCie hard drive back in the day. And I lost most of my video projects that I made when I was early in college, which is fine because I'm
There
sure
you
they
go.
sucked. Yeah.
So let's talk about some things that we're not talking about really quickly is your server and why would you want larger storage? So usually when you host your application, you get a server. And that server will have space that you can upload files to that will run your application, right? And they're often limited in terms of both how much space you're allowed to upload things to. So they'll give you, 20 gigs or 10 gigs, something like that. You can upload your whole application there. And often you can put files and images on there if you want. But the bandwidth for those things are very expensive because the people who supply you with compute are not necessarily the same people that supply you with large amount of storage and bandwidth. Often people will just stick a CDN in front of those files that are on the same server. That's a really good solution. This is not a show about CDNs, not a show about image compression, video streaming, things like that, because that's a whole nother level. And often those services that are image resizing, compression, CDN distribution around the world, those things sit on top of just your raw hosted object structure, which is what we're talking about today, which is basically just a place to put big files, big zips.
Yeah. And it's largely because these things really specialize in holding a lot of data, not necessarily distributing you that data. That's not their primary task.
Exactly. So big players in this space are like I think the big first one was Amazon S3. They kind of came out and said, "Hey, want to put stuff somewhere, and you'll probably have clicked on files at some point, and you see in the URL it says like bucket or S3 dot or US East. It's like in the URL of the name, it often will say these words, and that's kind of how you can tell that these files are actually being hosted on Amazon S3. And then along with Amazon S3, there's a whole bunch of different options out there. Cloudflare R2, which I thought was kind of funny. They took the letter and the number before S3 and named it. But then as I made this list, I realized Backblaze B2 is also like, did they do the 2 because of Amazon S3? And then
what's up with that? Yeah.
I'm assuming they did that. And then Synology has one, which I didn't realize, C2. And then all the usual suspects, Google Cloud Storage, Azure, DigitalOcean, Oracle, they all have this. And often they are all S3 compatible, meaning that if you just take a library, like Scott was talking to me about Pocketbase, and you can hook it up so that it'll upload files to S3. But you can just take your Cloudflare R2 credentials or your Backblaze B2 credentials and pop them in there, because a lot of these APIs are S3 compatible, so they'll work with anything.
Yeah, S3 was certainly the big player for a very long time. But yeah, I find myself using Backblaze B2 anytime I need to host anything anywhere, just because I'm very familiar with it. However, Cloudflare R2, yeah, I like Cloudflare a lot. Maybe I'll try that sometime.
Yeah. You're going to hear us talk a lot about Backblaze and Cloudflare, both because like I've used Backblaze, Amazon S3, Cloudflare, Google Cloud Storage, and Azure Storage. I've used all of those, but I like Cloudflare and Backblaze the best, and I'll tell you why in just a sec. But also this like Bunny.net keeps popping up as well. They seem to have both like streaming products, CDN products, but they also have a storage product as well. And the prices on it seem very good. So
I've never seen Bunny.
That's
interesting.
Every time I talk about it, somebody comes out and says, "Hey, check out Bunny," because they have a lot of interesting products out there.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. You know what? I think the big reason that I picked Backblaze and would even look at Cloudflare before Amazon isn't because of anything other than the dev experience of AWS. It's really easy to get going with Backblaze or Cloudflare for that matter. Things are more findable, less opaque, and it's just the nature of AWS.
I was thinking the other day, I was logged into my Backblaze, and I use Backblaze both to mirror my computers, and I use B2 to host a lot of files. And their entire product offering, this is a massive, massive company, is like 15 links in the sidebar. And like that's it.
Organization, come on. That's so good. You use the computer backup product?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I've been probably for 10 years now. It basically is just always, and that's one thing I'm doing is I'm always pausing it before we record this episode because it will continually back up my entire computer's hard drive to Backblaze B2. And if I were to ever lose my computer or drop it in the ocean, something like that, I'd be able to download my files. I've used it a couple times just to roll back and get older versions of files as well, which is something most of these providers do as well. If you upload the same file again, it keeps the older versions, which you can roll back to.
Yeah. Speaking of dropping your computer in the ocean, do you ever think one day it would feel real good to just, frisbee that thing right out into the ocean when you're feeling really angry at it? Yeah.
But then I would quickly go get it so it doesn't harm the environment. But yes.
Sure. Well, yes. Okay. This is a fictional thing. I'm not doing it.
Fictional. Yeah, I would feel it's like an Office Space type of thing.
Yes. Totally.
All right. So let's talk about, we're going to break it down into storage fees, bandwidth fees, retrieval fees, and operation fees or retrieval speed. Sorry. So the first one is storage fees, and you can kind of break down the cost of these things into how much does it cost to hold data in there month to month? And how much does it cost to get the data out if people are downloading it? Because some of these providers are cheap to hold data, but more expensive to download it. And some of them are a little bit more expensive to hold data, and they go as far as being free to download them. So storage, it costs money just to hold on to data. Cloudflare is a 1.5 cents per gig per month, whereas Backblaze is 0.6 cents per gig per month. So I'm taking a look at mine. I have 2.5 terabytes of data being stored in Backblaze B2 right now. And because that is not purely, but almost entirely backup and downloads for my video courses, I actually don't incur any bandwidth, and it's just storage fees. So for 2.5 terabytes of data is $15 per month for me to sort of hold it on there, that's cheap. But then you start thinking about like this podcast episode, after we're done recording it, saving the high quality versions, editing it, and exporting it, every episode's probably wet. Like, we should get Randy to tell us, but it's probably 30 gigs, right?
Yeah, it's not small.
If you think about 30, let's do the math right now. 30 gigs times 150 episodes, that's 4.5 terabytes a year for this podcast. So that would probably cost $40 a year to host, or to hold on to, without even downloading it, just to hold on to it. And $40, not too much. But then you start to think about, like, I often think about Riverside, how much are they paying in order to host all of these files and hold on to them for forever? Because Riverside's it's not expensive. It's like $250 a year. And we have probably 5 terabytes of data stored with them.
Yeah, it's funny, Wes. I was just doing some clean out of my NAS because, it just builds up a lot of duplicate files or things that are just, stuff you didn't want to keep anyways, that just kind of made it on there. And I found a raw footage file from a ScreenFlow project that was 200 gigabytes. And I was just like, what is going? I was like, this is taking up so much space. I must have just recorded a very long time. I didn't even look at it. I just deleted it. It was like,
so if you were to pop that on Cloudflare, 200 gigs at 1.5 cents each, that's $3 a year to hold on to that file. That's kind of expensive, don't you think?
That is kind of expensive, yeah. Yeah, that's the truth.
Oh, man. So other ones, I won't go through all the prices. Amazon S3 is actually quite a bit more expensive, 2.5 cents per gig. And then, at least when I did it, this was many years ago, it was also where you store it, it costs different amounts. Like, because you have to pick where you're going to store it, right? Do you want to put this in Virginia, or do you want to put this in Australia? And then when we'll talk about bandwidth in just a sec, but I was looking at the prices, and I have a lot of people from India download my courses, and India is the most expensive, at least it was at the time, for people to download from. Maybe that was their CDN product, if I'm thinking about that again, because that doesn't make sense that it would cost more depending on where they're coming from. It's just the internet, right? But it would cost more if you need to put them in different locations.
Yeah. So this stuff is so cheap, even though we just talked about it being a little bit of expensive, but like, it is so cheap. And I think that's due to, one, the drives that they're storing this stuff on, they're not optimized for read and write speed, right? They're optimized for long-term storage. Even when you buy disks for your local NAS at home, the drives that you're buying are different. They're not optimized to read and write fast. Because of that, data has gotten so cheap that now we can just toss a whole bunch of stuff up on the cloud is really what it comes down to. And it doesn't need to be super duper fast. And if it does, then you're probably going to be paying more for that feature, right?
Yeah, there was a website I was on, and they were trying to explain like this concept called temperature, which is like the faster it is to retrieve your data, because some of it does need to be retrieved extremely fast.
Mhm.
The faster it is to retrieve your data, the more expensive it is. And you can even go one step further. And if you put a CDN in front of one of these, it's even more expensive because they're distributing copies around the world. So it's faster. And the slower it is, the cheaper it gets, because like Amazon has a product. This is one of the feature things, but I'll just talk about it now. Amazon has this thing called Amazon Glacier, which is offline cold storage. I think Azure has their own version of it as well, where it will take longer. Like I went to download some of our old episodes and it takes 8 hours. You have to request it. And then 8 hours later, you get an email and says, hey, it's ready. Or 24 hours later, you get an email, this is ready for download. And that's because they are putting less frequently accessed episodes on cold storage so that it is much cheaper to hold on to. And then there's a process for getting it off of tape. You have to go into Jeff Bezos' basement and pull the VHS off the shelf, and some poor person has like a FireWire 800 on an old Mac, and they pop it in and put it on a USB stick and then run it over to you.
Wow.
Something like that. Yeah.
That's quite the story. If we had an animator, I would love to have somebody animate that.
Let's talk about bandwidth now. So storage is one thing to think about, but the other one is to think about bandwidth, or often it's referred to as egress. So when your data now needs to leave the server because it is being requested by somebody to download that file, then you also will incur some sort of costs. Now, the kind of interesting thing that has been happening lately is a lot of these cloud storage providers are giving you free egress, which is wild to think. So Cloudflare R2, I just told you, it's 3 times more expensive than Backblaze B2, but it has free egress. So if you're hosting files that need to be, maybe they're a little bit smaller, but they're downloaded a ton. Like you think about these websites that offer like NES ROMs, or like I downloaded a couple Wii games when I hacked my Wii.
Yeah.
I was like, who's paying to let me download this like 6 gig file of Wii Bowling? Or I don't know how big it was, but it was many gigs, you know? So I often think about that. I'm like, I know how much this costs. That's kind of expensive to incur the bandwidth cost, but maybe they're using Cloudflare R2.
And is it just ads that's covering the cost of that? And it feels crazy, but they must be getting enough traffic to make it worth it. I do want to say, before we move on off of egress here as a concept, if you've ever heard the word ingress, is the opposite. So ingress is data coming into the system. Egress is data coming out of the system. You have an egress window at your house that's for leaving in case of an emergency.
I got one right here.
Yeah. So egress, ingress. Those are 2 words that it's like, those are kind of jargony words that you may have heard here and there, but ingress in, egress out.
Why is it not called outgress? We don't know.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. Yeah.
So Cloudflare, free bandwidth, free egress. Backblaze B2, it kind of has this really interesting thing. Well, they'll give you 3 times your storage in free bandwidth. So I'm hosting 2.5 terabytes. So that means I have 7.5 terabytes of free bandwidth. So like, honestly, I'm going to say right now, it's very hard to beat Backblaze B2. And they're like just like a wicked all around company, just because like, there's no weirdness around them. There's no like marketing fluff or anything like that. It's a really good company. So if you use lots and lots of bandwidth, probably Cloudflare R2 is for you. But if you're storing stuff long term and you have, like, for example, because I store so much backups, my actual course downloads never incur any bandwidth because I'm sort of offsetting them in that regard.
Yeah, Backblaze does 1 or 2 things and does them very well. They store things, they back up things, for sure.
Amazon S3 is 9 cents a gig for bandwidth, which is very expensive. I'm surprised a lot of people. That's the other thing about it is there's a lot of people on Amazon S3, but they can't necessarily get off of it because if you have 70 terabytes of user images, how much is it going to cost to move those all off of Amazon? You're going to incur the bandwidth for everything and then moving it off. So sometimes a lot of people say it's cheaper just to stay on this than it would be to use Amazon S3 and to move it off and pay the egress fees for that.
It's also a pain in the ass to even update all the paths now. You have all these paths that presumably have all now changed, right? I had to do that with Level Up because S3 I found to be very slow when I was hosting my courses there. I just moved into Backblaze. It was going to be cheaper and faster for me. Yeah, it was still a pain. It was a massive pain to swap out all of those paths.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Yeah.
Here's my tip for that is don't use the Amazon S3 URLs. Put a custom domain name in front of them. Because if you do ever change them, at least you can write like a worker or something like that to jump in between and rewrite those paths.
Still pain though, right?
It's huge pain. Yeah. That's a lot of work, and it's likely not worth it for a lot of people.
Totally.
There's also this thing called the Bandwidth Alliance, which gives you either free or reduced cost of egress between service providers. So talk about fat pipes. A lot of these cloud providers got fat pipes between each other. So, for example, Backblaze and Cloudflare, they have like a little string behind the offices where they can call each other directly, little tin can. And they say, all right, well, if somebody asks me for your data or if I ask for your data, it's going to be free. And that's really cool because if you have a worker on Cloudflare, but your files are stored on Backblaze and you need to download the file in order to work with it in a worker, that's free because it's just going data center to data center and it's not really costing them that much because they got a fat pipe between the two of them.
You're really killing the metaphor today.
Thank you. Who else is part of this? Azure and Google Cloud are discounted, they say. Mm-hmm. And then there's free. I'm trying to see any of the big ones out there. There's a list of them. Automatic is a big one, which is kind of interesting. So I guess like if you've got a massive WordPress site and you want to move your WordPress files to Cloudflare, you could, or vice versa. DreamHost, Backblaze, Oracle. And then there's a bunch I have never heard of here. Last thing we have here is just operation fees. These also cost money. So every time that you create what's called a bucket, which is kind of like a folder in these cloud providers, that's an action, right? It's an API hit. Create a bucket, right? Mm-hmm. Every time you upload a chunk to a file, that's an action, right? Every time you see if a file exists, that's an action. Every time you delete a file, that's an action. Most of those actions, except for like deleting files, they charge you by the million for those actions. So there's not a ton of them, but every single request of a URL, it has to pull up that file that lives behind that URL, and that is one action. And the costs for those are relatively minimal. What do we got here? Cloudflare puts them into Class A and Class B operations, which is Class A is like upload, list files in a bucket, list all of my buckets. And then Class B is like check if a file is there or get the file size, but not download the file. So those are 1 million for $4.50 a month. And then 10 million of the Class B is 36 cents a month. So if you have 1 million images that are downloaded, that will cost you $4.50 for the initial request, but then the bandwidth would be free.
Yeah. Most people, not something that they're worrying about too much.
I think, and also like if you have such a scale that big, then you're going to basketball games and having dinners with the sales reps at these companies and
basketball games.
Yeah, you're negotiating like your own terms on these things. You're not taking the pricing page carte blanche. Mm-hmm. So that's that's all we got today for cloud storage providers, bandwidths, and big zips. Hopefully you learned a thing or two, and we will catch you later.
Peace.
Peace.